He is deeply in love with you. That much is clear. There's no question about the feelings he carries, no confusion about the way his heart responds when you're around. The love is real and runs deep, moving through him like a second heartbeat he can't control or silence. But what he's hiding isn't the love itself. What he's hiding is the way you expose him, the way your very presence peels back layers he spent years building up, brick by careful brick. Your presence doesn't just make his heart flutter in the gentle way love songs talk about. It does something far more unsettling, something that reaches deeper. It brings forgotten parts of him back to the surface, parts he buried so deep he almost convinced himself they never existed in the first place. Desires he learned to push down because they seemed too raw, too vulnerable, too honest for the world he built around himself. Weaknesses he covered over just to survive, to function, to be the person everyone expected him to be. You didn't disrupt his life the way a sudden storm disrupts calm waters. You revealed what was already there beneath the surface, what was already messy and unresolved and waiting. This kind of connection doesn't feel gentle or comfortable. It doesn't feel like the soft, easy falling that people describe when they talk about meeting someone special. It feels ancient, like something that existed long before either of you were born. It feels unavoidable, like gravity or fate or whatever invisible force pulls the ocean toward the shore. There's a heaviness to it, a certainty that makes it impossible to brush off as simple attraction or a passing crush. When he looks at you, something inside him recognizes itself. This isn't something he can think his way through. He can't explain it with words or make sense of it with logic. It happens in his body, in his bones, in the sudden catch of his breath, in the way his entire being knows you before his mind has time to catch up. It's as if you're holding up a mirror to the version of him he left behind long ago. The version who felt things completely and deeply. The version who hadn't yet learned to protect himself by becoming smaller, quieter, more acceptable to others. The version who still believed in magic and meaning and connections that go beyond ordinary understanding. That's why the pull between you feels so powerful, so intoxicating. Because when he's near you, he remembers what it felt like to be whole. He remembers the parts of himself he gave up to become functional, successful, safe. And for brief, beautiful moments, he touches that wholeness again. He feels what it's like to be truly seen, not just the polished surface he shows to the world. And it's gorgeous and terrifying at the same time. That's also why he pulls away just as strongly as he's drawn in. Because loving you doesn't just mean adding someone to his life. It's not about making space in his calendar or his apartment or his daily routine. Loving you would require him to become someone entirely new. It would mean tearing down the careful walls of protection he's spent years building. It would mean admitting that the person he's been pretending to be isn't the person he truly is underneath. It would mean transformation. And transformation is perhaps the scariest thing any human being can face. So he hesitates. He moves toward you and then away, like ocean waves
that can't decide whether to crash onto the shore or retreat back to the safety of deep water. He falls back into familiar patterns, into the life he knows, into the identity he's created for himself. But this pulling away doesn't come from not caring. It comes from caring too much, from recognizing that this connection will change absolutely everything. Some people spend their entire lives running from the very things they want most desperately, because wanting something means risking everything. And risking means the possibility of loss, or pain, or the death of who they've always been. His hesitation isn't rejection of you. It's fear of becoming someone different.
Some bonds don't ask to be experienced lightly, like casual entertainment or comfortable companionship. They demand to be fully absorbed. They require you to take them into your very core and let them reshape you from the inside out. They insist on fundamental change. And change, even when it leads somewhere better, requires letting go of what was. That letting go can feel like dying a small death, even when it creates space for new life to begin. And yet, despite his resistance, despite all his retreats and hesitations, the connection doesn't vanish. It doesn't fade away the way ordinary attractions do when they're not fed or encouraged. It stays alive in silence, in the spaces between words, in the absence that somehow feels just as powerful as being together. It shows up in dreams, both the ones he has while sleeping and the ones that visit him during quiet moments in the middle of the day. It appears in moments that feel too specific to be random, too meaningful to be mere coincidence. A song on the radio that reminds him of you. A phrase someone says that you once said. A smell or a color or a feeling that brings you flooding back into his mind. There's a quiet knowing that something unfinished still exists between you. It's not desperate or demanding. It simply is, patient and persistent, like a seed waiting underground for the right season to finally grow. This knowing lives in both of you, whether you talk about it or not. It's the sense that whatever exists between you hasn't reached its natural conclusion, hasn't fulfilled its purpose, hasn't yet become what it was always meant to be. You were never meant to chase him. Your role in this story was never about pursuit, never about convincing him of your worth, never about proving yourself or fighting for his attention. Those actions would actually work against the deeper purpose of this connection. Chasing him would let him stay exactly where he is, would let him avoid the very confrontation with himself that this connection is demanding. It would turn something sacred and meaningful into something ordinary and transactional. You were meant to awaken what he's been avoiding all along. Simply by being who you are, by existing in your truth and your authentic light, you remind him of what he's been running from. Not running from you specifically, but running from the truth of himself. Running from vulnerability and depth and the kind of love that transforms people rather than just comforts them. Your presence is a catalyst, not a final destination. You're not the answer he needs to find. You're the question he needs to finally ask himself. The question stays with him because it has no easy answer. Who would he be if he stopped hiding? Not the polished version, not the carefully managed self he built for survival, but the unguarded one, the one who feels first and thinks later. Who would he become if he allowed himself to feel everything he's been holding back? The grief he swallowed to stay functional, the longing he pushed down to stay reasonable, the tenderness he buried so he wouldn't appear weak or needy. What would his life look like if he stopped choosing safety over truth, comfort over growth, familiarity over the vast, unknown territory of real intimacy? These questions don't arrive politely at his door. They don't knock and wait for permission. They show up in the quiet moments when all his distractions finally run out, when his body relaxes just enough for his heart to start speaking. They keep him awake at night because they threaten the entire structure of the carefully constructed life he's built. They don't ask for small adjustments or minor tweaks. They ask for complete reorientation. And that takes courage. Not the loud, dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet bravery of staying present when every instinct is screaming at you to run away. For some people, these questions feel like an invitation to something better. For others, they feel like an existential threat to everything they know. And so, he runs. Not from you, not from the connection itself, but from what it stirs up inside him. He runs from the internal reckoning these questions demand. He creates distance not because he doesn't care, but because he cares so deeply, it shakes the entire story he's been telling himself about who he is, what he wants, and how much he's willing to risk. There's a particular kind of fear that only shows up when something truly matters. We're never afraid of things that don't touch us deeply. Indifference never asks for transformation. Habit never demands growth. But a connection that reaches past the surface and into the unfinished, tender places of the self, that kind of connection is deeply disruptive. It shines bright light into rooms that have been locked for years. It asks whether the defenses that once protected him have quietly become prisons instead. And facing that question can feel like standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea whether there's solid ground on the other side. So he chooses distance, not as rejection, but as self-preservation. He tells himself he needs space, time, clarity, anything that sounds safer than the real truth, which is that something deep in him is being called forward before he feels anywhere near ready. He may not have words for this. He may only know the sensation of being overwhelmed, the instinct to pull back, the desperate need to regain some sense of control. From the outside, it can look like simple avoidance. From the inside, it feels like pure survival. But here is what makes the kind of connection you share fundamentally different. It does not force or corner. It does not issue ultimatums or demand strict timelines. It does not insist on proof or guarantees. It simply exists, steady and unthreatening, like a truth that doesn't need to shout to be heard. It waits, not passively, but patiently, with the calm confidence of something that knows it cannot be forced and doesn't need to be. This kind of connection operates outside of urgency and rush. It understands that real growth follows its own natural rhythm, that readiness cannot be negotiated or demanded, that genuine transformation ripens in its own sweet time. It trusts a process much larger than either person's fear or resistance. Because recognition at this depth, this sense of being truly seen beyond all performance or protection, doesn't follow human schedules or timelines. It unfolds according to an internal clock, one that's governed by deep integration, not surface desire. And so it waits, not because it lacks value, but because it has tremendous value. Not because it's uncertain, but because it's secure enough to allow space and breathing room. It understands that pressure and pushing would only reinforce the very walls it's trying to dissolve. It knows that the work being asked for here isn't relational persuasion or romantic pursuit, but genuine personal evolution and growth. What you're really naming here is one of the hardest truths about loving someone who isn't yet able to meet themselves. Nothing meaningful changes until the pain of staying the same outweighs the fear of becoming different. And that reckoning never comes from the outside. It doesn't come from persuasion, from logic, from perfect timing, or from someone else loving harder, waiting longer, or explaining themselves more clearly. It comes from an internal exhaustion so quiet and so personal that no one else can trigger it or prevent it. It arrives when the strategies that once kept him safe, distance, distraction, self-protection, emotional withdrawal, begin to cost more than they offer. When the numbness becomes heavier than the vulnerability he's been avoiding. When the loneliness of disconnection finally eclipses the familiarity of hiding. Until that point, everything external remains secondary. You can be patient, insightful, compassionate, emotionally available. You can reflect truth with gentleness and presence instead of pressure. But none of that replaces the moment when he himself recognizes that avoidance is no longer neutral, no longer harmless, no longer survivable. That moment is not dramatic. It doesn't look like an epiphany or a sudden confession. It looks more like a subtle turning inward, an unspoken pause where the running stops, not because someone blocked the exits, but because the exits no longer promise relief. When he turns inward, it will not be with certainty. It will be with discomfort and curiosity. He will sit with feelings he once fled from, not because he suddenly enjoys them, but because something in him understands that they are asking to be witnessed rather than escaped. He will question the stories he once relied on, stories about independence, about self-sufficiency, about not needing anyone, about timing or circumstances or incompatibility. And he will notice the cracks in those narratives. not all at once, quietly, honestly, in moments where he can no longer ignore the dissonance between who he tells himself he is and who he feels himself becoming. The mirror you have been holding matters here, but not in the way people often imagine. You were never meant to be a teacher or a savior or a catalyst through force. You were a mirror of recognition, not judgment. A reflection that did not accuse or demand, but simply revealed. You showed him what presence feels like, without trying to trap him inside it. You showed him what depth feels like, without insisting he dive before he was ready. That kind of mirror does not shout. It waits. And when someone finally dares to look into it, they don't just see the connection. They see themselves more clearly than they ever have. That recognition is destabilizing. It removes the comfort of denial. It introduces possibility where resignation once lived. And possibility is terrifying to someone who has survived by lowering expectations and narrowing emotional range. To become aware of what could be means confronting what has been avoided, postponed, or left unrealized. It means grieving versions of self that never fully emerged. It means acknowledging that safety was purchased at the cost of aliveness. So when the shift happens, it will not be because vulnerability has suddenly become easy. It will be because vulnerability has become necessary. Because staying closed has started to feel like a slow suffocation rather than protection. Because the walls that once felt essential now feel outdated, heavy, and strangely pointless. Defenses only make sense when something is perceived as a threat. When connection is no longer framed as danger, but as invitation, chosen rather than endured, those defenses lose their relevance. They don't need to be torn down. They simply stop being used. This is why there is no dramatic collapse, no explosive confession, no sudden transformation into someone unrecognizable. Growth rarely announces itself. It integrates. It settles. It changes the internal orientation before it ever alters external behavior. He will stay in conversations that once made him restless. He will tolerate emotional ambiguity instead of fleeing towards certainty. He will allow himself to feel without immediately fixing, numbing, or rationalizing it away. These are small shifts, but they are irreversible ones. They signal a willingness to be present where he once disappeared. Only from that place can he truly meet you. Not as someone negotiating distance or carefully managing exposure, but as someone integrated enough to remain. Presence requires wholeness, not perfection, but coherence. The ability to hold fear and desire at the same time without defaulting to escape. The capacity to stay when staying matters. Without that internal work, any attempt at closeness becomes conditional, fragile, and unsustainable. With it, connection stops being a threat and starts being a choice. And it's crucial to understand this. None of that work was ever yours to do for him. You were never meant to convince him of your worth or prove that connection is safe, or minimize yourself to reduce his fear. That path only leads to self-abandonment, and self-abandonment is never the price of real love. Your work was never to become smaller, quieter, less intense, less honest, or less alive so that he could remain comfortable. Comfort that depends on your diminishment is not intimacy. It is accommodation at the expense of truth. Your work has always been internal as well, but in a different direction. It has been to remain anchored in yourself while loving deeply. To resist the urge to chase clarity when someone else is unavailable to offer it. To hold your boundaries not as punishment or withdrawal, but as self-respect. To trust what you feel without requiring immediate confirmation from someone who may not yet be able to give it. That is not passive waiting. It is active alignment. There is a profound difference between waiting in depletion and waiting in self-trust. One slowly hollows you out, draining your vitality drop by drop until you barely recognize the shape of your own life. The other quietly fortifies you, layering resilience and clarity beneath the surface, even when the external world offers no visible progress. When you choose not to abandon yourself while someone else remains undecided, frozen in hesitation, tangled in their own unresolved patterns, you are issuing a quiet but unshakable declaration. Your existence does not depend on their timeline. Your worth is not a variable that rises and falls with their willingness or capacity to show up fully. You refuse to place your entire sense of aliveness on hold, waiting for permission that may never arrive. Instead, you continue to live. You continue to grow. You continue to love yourself first, then others, then the world in all its messy beauty. You create meaning that stands on its own, that requires no external validation or reciprocation to remain legitimate and luminous. This refusal to self-abandon is not indifference. It is the deepest form of reverence for your own being. It acknowledges that love, real love, cannot be sustained by one person carrying the full weight of possibility alone. When we wait in depletion, we often slip into subtle forms of self-betrayal, diminishing our needs, silencing our intuition, shrinking our desires to fit the narrow space someone else is willing to occupy. Over time, this becomes a habit of erasure. We learn to apologize for our depth, to mute our vibrancy, to treat our longing as inconvenient rather than sacred. But when we wait, or rather, when we live rooted in self-trust, we honor the truth that our wholeness was never contingent on another's arrival. We protect the flame within us not by extinguishing it to avoid being seen too brightly, but by feeding it oxygen through daily acts of self-respect. Many people misunderstand the true nature of certain connections precisely because they measure significance by immediacy and tangible outcome. If a bond does not quickly solidify into partnership, commitment, or mutual certainty, it is dismissed as false, fleeting, or failed. Yet not every encounter is designed to culminate in visible form right away. or perhaps ever in the shape we originally imagined. Some people enter our lives as mirrors, as disruptors, as quiet revolutionaries of the inner landscape. They arrive not to complete us, but to initiate something irreversible within us, an awakening that cannot be undone, a clarification that sharpens our vision of what we truly desire, a deepening of self-awareness that makes superficial connections feel intolerable from that point forward. These catalytic connections rearrange the furniture of the soul. They show us the texture of real depth, how it feels to be met with presence rather than performance, with curiosity rather than defensiveness, with honesty rather than evasion. Once tasted, that quality becomes non-negotiable. You cannot unknow it. You cannot return to accepting crumbs when you have experienced a feast, even if that feast was brief or incomplete. The connection may not lead to a shared life, but it has already succeeded in its deeper purpose. It has raised the standard of what you will allow in your heart. It has reminded you that you are capable of profound intimacy, and therefore deserving of it, not as a distant fantasy, but as a lived reality. Think of seeds. They are planted in silence, often in darkness. After the initial moment of contact with soil, they vanish from sight. Days, weeks, months pass with no green shoot breaking the surface. To the impatient eye, nothing is happening. It can feel like abandonment, like wasted effort, like a mistake. Yet beneath the ground, roots are threading their way through layers of earth, seeking water, anchoring themselves against future storms. Visible growth is impossible until those roots are strong enough to support it. The same is true of emotional and spiritual awakening. It rarely announces itself with fanfare. It unfolds in quiet increments. A sudden insight during a solitary walk, a softening in old defenses, a willingness to feel what you once numbed. Integration, the process of embodying what has been revealed, demands time. Anything forced or rushed will crack under pressures it was never prepared to bear. Patience here is not passive resignation, it is active faith in unseen processes. In this particular connection, you have already fulfilled your role with extraordinary integrity. You showed up fully, without masks or agendas. You offered your truth without wielding it as a weapon or a bargaining chip. You remained present without trying to script the ending or hurry the unfolding. That quality of presence, unmanipulative, uncoercive, unattached to specific outcomes, is exceptionally rare in a world that so often confuses love with control. It leaves an imprint that does not vanish when the visible thread between you frays or pauses. Even if no grand reunion ever materializes, what you gave was real. It entered the energetic field between you and continues to reverberate, becoming a silent reference point for both of you, a quiet knowing that authentic encounter is possible, that vulnerability can be met without punishment, that depth does not have to be feared. What unfolds next belongs entirely to the other person. Their fear, their readiness, their internal threshold, these are territories you cannot enter, map, or manage. You can invite, you can witness, you can hold space, but you cannot cross that line for them. Whether they eventually step forward or remain on the other side does not retroactively erase the truth of what passed between you. It merely reveals the current boundaries of what is shareable. Clarity in this form is not cruelty, it is mercy. It spares you the prolonged agony of ambiguity. It returns you to your own sovereignty. Information, even when painful, is kinder than illusion. So you continue, not armored against feeling, not hardened into bitterness, not sealed shut against future possibility. You continue grounded in the knowledge of your own worth. You continue aligned with your values and your inner compass. You keep choosing yourself, not as an act of rejection toward the other, but as an affirmation of what you have learned you require to thrive. You allow life to keep moving rather than freezing at the threshold of someone else's becoming. You do not pause your own evolution to wait for theirs to catch up. You trust that anything truly meant to meet you at the level of depth you now embody will arrive carrying availability instead of ambivalence, presence instead of resistance, reciprocity instead of retreat. It will not ask you to shrink, to wait indefinitely, to prove your value through endurance. It will recognize you because you never stopped being recognizably yourself. And perhaps this is the most liberating truth of all. Your path does not narrow, contract, or terminate simply because another soul is still navigating their own labyrinth. Their learning curve does not dictate the pace or direction of yours. Your life retains its momentum. Your becoming continues to unfold, richer, more textured, more courageous for having loved without losing yourself in the process. The connections that are real, enduring, and aligned with your truest frequency will find their way to you, not because you chased them, manipulated circumstances, or dimmed your light to make room for hesitation, but because you remained luminous, rooted, and in motion. You kept walking your path with open eyes and an open heart, trusting that what belongs with you will meet you there, not as a reward for patience, but as a natural consequence of fidelity to who you are. In the end, this is the quiet revolution of self-trust. It transforms waiting from a state of lack into a state of fullness. It turns uncertainty from a threat into a teacher. It allows you to hold both grief for what has not yet arrived and gratitude for what has already been given. You are no longer suspended between hope and despair. You are living in the wide, breathing present, where your worth is not on trial and your life is not deferred. Whatever comes next, whether reunion, release, or something entirely unforeseen, you meet it as someone who has already chosen themselves. And that choice, repeated daily, becomes the strongest root of all.